Hello everyone and welcome back to Embroidery Tutorials. We are stitching our way through my 90 variation chain stitch sampler, which is made up of 7 different circles, easy to sew on their own, covering a huge variety of stitches from super easy basic ones to complex ones you may never have heard of. But all these stitches have a base in the OG chain stitch, which is such a delight to me. Today we are learning raised chain band and checkered chain band. I'm going to show you 2 versions of raised chain band because you can do the original single version, or you can actually use this as a fill stitch of sorts, albeit for pretty specific shapes, with some lovely bumpy and, raised texture. Let's get started with single raised chain band. I'm going to sew this one with cotton pearl thread and a larger needle, just because I love how a chunkier thread adds to the raised texture of it. You can do this with any weight of thread, but thinner ones are definitely going to have a very different look in the end. Start out with your underlying color. You don't have to change colors on this stitch, but I love using as many colors as possible, creating a series of straight stitches back and forth down your long rectangle. You want these to be nice and even with the same amount of space between each one, although you don't necessarily have to space them exactly as I have. You can go a little closer together or further apart for a slightly different end look. Once you have this little ladder laid out, you can change your thread color if you want, and we are coming up right above and in the center of your very first stitch. Slide the needle underneath that stitch in an upward movement and to the left of your original entry point. This wraps the thread around this first stitch one time. Now we're coming back in the opposite direction to create the chain part of this stitch. Lay out a loop with your thread so you can see where you're going, and then slide your needle underneath the first stitch again, this time on the right side from top to bottom. Your needle should be coming through on top of the loop you've created here, which makes a little chain-like loop around this straight stitch. That's one stitch, so now you'll just be repeating that pattern. Again, we're going upward under the stitch, aiming towards the left, then coming back in the opposite direction to form that loop before coming downward under the right side of that straight stitch, going through the loop you've created. If you want these stitches to be tighter and closer together, you can pull your thread upward gently. But if you want a chunkier stitch, then just gently tighten it by pulling downward before starting your next stitch. You'll also want to keep your stitches nice and centered on your ladder, but since they aren't going through the fabric, you can actually slide them around a little bit like this. Once you get to the last stitch, pull it a little tighter than your previous one, then go back down through the fabric right underneath and in the center of your last straight stitch, and you're all done. Now let's try a fill version of this stitch. I'm starting out with the same ladder-like row of straight stitches in my rectangle, which I'm making a little closer together this time than my single row. I'm also now using regular embroidery floss, but I'm still using 6 strands rather than the traditional 3 so that it looks a little chunkier and fills in better. I've changed thread colors and now I'm coming up towards the left of this top line. I'm intending to get 3 rows of raised chain on here, which will make it quite full with this thicker thread, but you can do just 2 if you'd like. While stitching the first row, I'm making sure that my stitches are pushed into the left side of the ladder as much as possible. I'm going to flip my piece now and stitch my second row in the opposite direction, just for a little fun on my own part. But you can also tie off your thread or just come back up at the top again if you want all of your raised chain going in the same direction. I've come up directly in the center now and I'm keeping my stitches pressed against the first row, since I'm going to squeeze another whole row on here. If you want more room, remember you can always push these stitches over with your finger because they aren't attached to the fabric. Flipping my piece again, I'm now starting my third row of raised chain on the right side of my ladder, squeezing these stitches in to totally fill up the space. If you're making your stitches this close together, just make sure you are still going around the proper places on the threads. And there we go. By filling up our little ladder with multiple rows of raised chain, we get this lovely full band with loads of texture raised off the surface of our fabric. This stitch ends up having a similar look to a lot of more complicated braided stitches like braided band or closed Spanish knotted feather stitch, so it can be a really nice alternative to those. Last up, we're going to work on some checkered chain band. Now, if you look up checkered chain stitch instead of band, you'll get a lot of results for an alternating chain stitch or magic chain stitch, which I've covered in a previous tutorial. Just a note on how that slight difference in the title can suddenly mean a totally different stitch. And with that, let's start stitching. This lovely stitch can use up to 3 different colors, so break out that rainbow of thread. I'm using 6 strands of floss for the base and then 3 for the top sections. But this is another good one to use bigger or weightier threads on, so feel free to try out some cotton pearl or anything like that. We're going to start out by laying down a little ladder of straight stitches, just like we did on the raised chain bands. These should be nice and even, but again, you can alter the distance between them somewhat for slightly different looks. Once my ladder is laid down, I'm going to thread 2 different needles with 2 different colors of thread. Though I'm using 3 strands on each needle, I'm actually going to knot the ends together, turning it into a 6-strand piece. You'll see why in a moment. With your first color, come up at the top of your ladder, slightly above and centered on that first stitch. Take that thread over the first straight stitch and then underneath the second. Then grab your other needle. This one comes up right above the second straight stitch, in the middle of the 2 legs from your first thread. This is why you want to double the thread up rather than just using 6 strands. No matter how thick of thread you're using, you want it to already be separated into 2 sections. Separate the legs of your second thread color and bring the first thread, needle and all, through the center, placing it up and out of the way. Take your second needle and slide it under the third straight stitch. Then separate the legs of your first color and draw the whole second color through it, switching their positions. Continue taking one color underneath the straight stitch and then through the other to create this alternating pattern of chain-like stitches. Now I must note, and you may have already noticed, that I accidentally switched the pattern sequence right here on my band. This was because I took the first thread through the second, rather than the second through the first one in my early stitches, and then I continued that pattern to the end. As a result, it looks like I stitched in the opposite direction. So the basic principle is no different, whether you take the first thread through the second or vice versa. You will just want to do the same thing the whole time, unlike I did here with randomly switching at the beginning because I was listening to a podcast and got distracted. Whoops. As always, thank you so much for joining me here for embroidery tutorials. I've really enjoyed these 3 ladder-based stitches, and I've even started to work the fill version of raised chain into some of my other pieces, so I'd love to see what you're able to do with them too. Next week we'll be covering some butterfly chain, so come on back for that. I will see you then, and thanks so much for watching.